Throughout the early months of 1986, search teams combed the ocean floor along Florida's coastline, looking for fragments of the Space Shuttle Challenger. Only weeks earlier, the world had witnessed the orbiter vanish into an enormous fireball 73 seconds into its ascent. The disaster left the nation reeling, as viewers everywhere believed they had seen 7 courageous crew members perish in that fiery moment. But the reality lying scattered across the Atlantic seabed told a far more complex and disturbing tale. As recovery teams brought up wreckage from the destroyed vehicle, accident investigators started piecing together what actually transpired during Challenger's last flight. Their findings would reveal overlooked safety concerns, organizational hubris, and a chilling truth about what occurred after the initial explosion. So what caused a microscopic flaw to trigger complete catastrophe for America's celebrated space initiative? Which remarkable individual aboard represented an irreplaceable loss? And what did the investigation team learn that made the incident even more harrowing than initially understood? This is the account of how a single term came to represent the way minor issues can cascade into absolute disaster. Challenger. The time was 1986, an era defined by bold fashion, corporate expansion, and ambitious thinking. The Cold War remained in full swing, with Reagan facing off against Gorbachev. The United States found itself significantly trailing the Soviets in the space arena. Though Washington operated the flashier program, complete with distant planetary probes, military observation systems, and sophisticated scientific instruments, the Soviet Union had executed substantially more launches and accumulated far greater expertise in maintaining orbital crews for extended durations. Yet NASA refused to simply concede defeat. They had their pride at stake. So during the early years of the 1980s, a fresh series of orbital flights using a new shuttle began captivating the scientific world. That shuttle was Challenger. Challenger's maiden voyage took place in 1983. By the point where our story truly begins, the orbiter had completed 9 successful flights since its public introduction. These missions included historic milestones, such as Sally Ride becoming the first American woman to reach orbit, and Guion Bluford becoming the first African American to journey into space. NASA had established highly ambitious objectives for the shuttle program in 1986, scheduling as many as 15 missions, including the first launch from America's western seaboard at what today is known as Vandenberg Space Force Base in California. Additional planned achievements included deploying 2 interplanetary spacecraft, conducting an astronomical observation mission to study Halley's Comet during its return passage through the inner solar system, and placing the Hubble Space Telescope into orbit. Needless to say, events did not unfold as intended. Challenger's 10th mission received its launch date for January. By late December of 1985, the shuttle stood ready on its launch platform at Cape Canaveral, Florida. The mission's main goal involved placing a communication satellite into orbit to serve as a data relay system. This represented a genuinely important step forward for the United States, as it would enable nearly uninterrupted communication links during future shuttle operations and theoretically enhance safety measures for American astronauts on subsequent missions. The deployment of this satellite was scheduled for the first day after Challenger achieved orbit. On the 3rd mission day, the crew would release the Spartan Halley astronomy satellite to study the renowned comet. Speaking of the crew, who were the 7 individuals assigned to execute this significant mission and bring space-related achievement back to the United States? Let us introduce them. The spacecraft commander was Francis Dick Scobie, holding overall mission authority, overseeing crew operations, and making critical decisions during flight procedures. He would share piloting responsibilities with astronaut Michael Smith. 3 astronauts comprised the mission specialist team: Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, and Ellison Onizuka, who had made history as the first Asian American in space. These specialists would manage Challenger's experimental operations and handle satellite deployments. Then there was payload specialist Gregory Jarvis, assigned specifically to conduct experiments for Hughes Aircraft, focusing on fluid behavior of liquid propellants in weightless conditions to advance future satellite engineering. Finally, the seventh crew member held no traditional astronaut training whatsoever. That person was Christa McAuliffe. In 1986, she was a 37-year-old middle school social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire. So how did an ordinary educator secure a position aboard the Challenger shuttle? Initially, there had been discussions about sending Big Bird. Yes, the Sesame Street character. The thinking was that launching the beloved oversized yellow bird into space would capture children's imaginations and inspire them to pursue space education. However, planners abandoned this idea because the costume standing over 8 feet tall simply could not fit inside the shuttle. Knowing how events ultimately unfolded, this decision spared Big Bird from a nationally televised tragedy. But returning to McAuliffe and how she came to join this mission, she won a competition. By the early 1980s, the Reagan administration had strained relations with the National Education Association following significant budget reductions. Someone within the White House conceived an idea to repair that relationship while simultaneously promoting the space program and generating goodwill throughout the education sector. They would organize a competition to send one American teacher into space. The initiative bore the straightforward title of NASA's Teacher in Space Project. Reagan himself made the announcement, stating that NASA would begin searching to select, as the first civilian passenger in the nation's space program history, one of America's finest educators. Apparently, being labeled America's finest carries more symbolic weight than actual funding commitments. Despite its somewhat politically motivated origins, the program generated tremendous enthusiasm. During the autumn of 1985, McAuliffe attended an educators' conference in Washington when she encountered a booth promoting the initiative. A colleague later recalled that McAuliffe picked up an application primarily thinking it would be an excellent method to inspire her students, not for personal fame, but because it represented something extraordinary and engaging. After submitting her application, she received a response from NASA. They inquired about her motivations for joining the program. From that point, the process accelerated considerably. More than 11,000 applications flooded in for the Teacher in Space project. From that enormous pool, the selection process eventually narrowed down to McAuliffe. She traveled to NASA facilities for evaluation alongside other educators who had reached the final selection stage. She stood out as the one who truly connected. There was something genuine in the way she engaged with reporters and the public, a natural ease that made people feel invested in her journey. So what role would she actually play up there? This wasn't going to be some passive joyride like the vanity trips wealthy individuals take into orbit these days. Her purpose was hands-on and educational. She would conduct lessons and run school experiments while circling the planet. If everything went according to plan, it would blend the miraculous with the relatable in a way no mission had done before. Yet as the launch date approached, problems started piling up. Challenger was originally supposed to lift off in July of 1985. That got bumped to November of the same year, then pushed again to January of 1986 because the payload kept changing. Perhaps the space agency was still wrestling with the idea of sending Big Bird along for the ride. The launch eventually landed on a target date of January 23rd, but weather complications and technical glitches kept forcing delays. By the time the 28th rolled around, the mission had been postponed multiple times. CBS evening anchor Dan Rather became notorious for his on-air frustration, describing the situation as today's high-tech, low comedy, an embarrassment, and yet another costly red faces all around space shuttle delay. Those words would haunt him later, but his irritation reflected a broader mood. This wasn't some routine flight. It was a high-visibility mission with enormous public interest, and it had been delayed 6 times. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union seemed to be sending cosmonauts into orbit as casually as tossing a frisbee across a lawn. The space agency felt mounting pressure to prove it could deliver, possibly driven by expectations from higher up the chain of command. That determination to avoid yet another postponement became one of several factors that converged on that tragic day. The evening of January 28th arrived, with liftoff scheduled for the following morning. Overnight, temperatures at the Cape Canaveral launch site dropped sharply, bottoming out at -5 degrees Celsius, which translates to 22 degrees Fahrenheit. For somewhere like Michigan, that might not raise eyebrows, but this was Florida. This bizarre, gator-filled peninsula where eccentric news stories are born is also home to some of the mildest winter weather anywhere in the continental United States. Central Florida typically sees winter temperatures hovering around 22 degrees Celsius or roughly 72 degrees Fahrenheit. The state does occasionally get slapped by cold fronts that bring brief, icy conditions, but the night before launch was abnormally cold, even by 1980s Florida standards, and that temperature drop had real implications for the hardware. Photographs from that morning show the launch tower draped in thick icicles, clinging to railings and coating camera equipment. On the morning of the launch, just a few hours before the crew was scheduled to board, a teleconference brought together engineers and senior management. The engineers raised alarms about the O-rings, thin rubber seals designed to prevent fuel from leaking between sections of the solid rocket boosters. Their concern was straightforward. Rubber loses flexibility in the cold, and if those seals couldn't expand properly, the integrity of the entire vehicle could be compromised. But in what has to rank among the most catastrophic judgment calls ever made, a manager at the space agency shot back with a line that became infamous. "When do you want me to launch? Next April?" The decision was made. The launch would proceed. All 7 astronauts walked out to the vehicle that would carry them toward the edge of space. Despite temperatures colder than any previous shuttle launch, and despite the explicit warnings from the engineering team, Commander Scobie delivered those now haunting words, "Roger, go at throttle up," as the rocket engines roared to life and the vehicle began its climb. Reports indicate that the crew was chatting excitedly in the moments after liftoff, their voices animated as they left the pale blue dot behind. Then something went wrong, something that would define the shuttle's legacy in the worst possible way. Challenger was moving at roughly twice the speed of sound when pilot Michael Smith noticed something alarming. Seated on the right side of the flight deck with a clear view through the window, Smith glanced outside and reportedly saw a brief flash of vapor or flame. What he said next would be preserved on the crew cabin recorder as the final words spoken by anyone aboard Challenger. It was simple and chilling. Uh-oh. The engineers' fears had materialized. The frigid Florida morning had caused the rubber O-rings holding the rocket booster segments together to stiffen. Under normal conditions, these seals were supposed to expand and create a tight barrier, keeping the volatile fuel contained until the boosters were jettisoned. But the cold prevented them from expanding fully. A tiny gap opened up in the lower right booster, less than 1 millimeter wide. Mission Control had no indication anything was wrong until telemetry showed pressure dropping in the right booster. By that point, the shuttle was already airborne. There was nothing anyone could do. That minuscule gap was all it took. Roughly 1 minute and 12 seconds after launch, the small flame intensified. In just 3 seconds, it burned completely through the aluminum skin of the adjacent external fuel tank. The tank ruptured almost immediately, igniting the hydrogen fuel inside. Challenger exploded. On live television, a massive detonation tore through the sky above Cape Canaveral, producing an enormous fireball and scattering wreckage in every direction. As the spacecraft disintegrated, the solid rocket boosters broke away and veered off on divergent trajectories. Fearing they could endanger people or vessels below, Air Force Range Safety Officer Major Gerald Beeringer armed the destruct charges and transmitted the signal to destroy them as well. Then an unsettling silence descended over Mission Control in Houston and Launch Control in Florida. Engineers stared at rows of the letter S scrolling across their monitors. Static. No signal. All communication with the shuttle had ceased. The image was broadcast into homes and classrooms across the United States, leaving anyone who witnessed it in real time deeply shaken. Many who saw it as children carry that image with them to this day, burned into memory. The sudden ignition of the fuel released an additional 2 million pounds of thrust in an instant, hurling the crew compartment outward and subjecting everyone inside to approximately 20 times the force of gravity. That was far beyond the 3 times gravity they had trained to endure. The nation collectively absorbed the horror as it became clear that Challenger and everyone aboard were gone. But the reality was actually far grimmer than most people realized in that moment. The natural assumption, watching the rocket and its fragments fall back toward Earth, was that the crew died instantly, vaporized by that colossal fireball. Under the circumstances, that would have been a merciful end. Even Mission Control initially believed the Challenger crew perished the moment of the explosion. After all, anyone looking at that massive blast would think, who could possibly survive that? Many people who witnessed the disaster assumed that nobody could have possibly made it through something so catastrophic. The images were horrifying, and the instinctive reaction was to think that the end must have come instantly. But that assumption turned out to be deeply mistaken. After extensive analysis of the explosion and the wreckage, with investigators at NASA comparing every detail to previous incidents involving aircraft and spacecraft that had broken apart in flight, they arrived at a deeply disturbing conclusion. The crew likely remained alive after the shuttle disintegrated, and evidence suggested they may have stayed conscious during the entire descent. But how could that be possible? The footage of the disaster is clear for everyone to see. How could anyone aboard Challenger have survived what happened up there? To understand that, we need to look more carefully at not only why Challenger came apart, but exactly how the breakup unfolded. Everything happened with terrifying speed when Challenger exploded. The failure of the O-ring caused one of the solid rocket boosters to tear loose, unleashing an enormous jet of flame that sliced across the shuttle and severed one wing. The immense forces involved snapped the opposite wing off as easily as breaking a stick. The vehicle did not detonate like a bomb or a missile. Instead, it ripped itself to pieces almost instantly due to the colossal physical forces at work. As this happened, all the remaining fuel was released at once, creating the massive fireball and vapor cloud that everyone saw. But the explosive dispersal of fuel probably did not cause fatal injuries or kill the crew outright, because they were still enclosed within their dedicated compartment. The brief spike of force, about 20 times the force of gravity, would have been intensely uncomfortable, but it lasted only a fraction of a second. Within just a few seconds, researchers would later determine the G-forces dropped back below 4, well within the tolerance limits for both the spacecraft structure and the human body. Likewise, when the crew compartment was eventually recovered, investigators found no signs that the orbiter's structure had been destroyed by explosive overpressure, internal fire, or extreme heat. Because of the way the fuel ignited in the open air, the explosion appeared extremely violent, but within moments all that fuel had burned away. What the blast actually did was fling the crew module and both wings clear of the main explosion zone. In some photographs of the disaster, you can clearly see both wings, and a completely intact crew compartment being thrown away from the enormous fireball. The heat did not obliterate the module because it was built from aluminum and specialized silicon tiles engineered to endure extreme temperatures during the craft's re-entry into the atmosphere at the end of a mission. The onboard computers were still operating, and in a moment of complete futility, they performed exactly as designed and shut down the engines upon detecting that no fuel remained. Of course, those engines were no longer even connected to the spacecraft, if you could still call Challenger a spacecraft at that point. Now it was essentially a large metal rock with none of the aerodynamic properties it once had. And very soon, it would begin falling like one. Data gathered during the investigation showed that Challenger broke apart at roughly 48,000 feet, or approximately 14,630 meters above the Atlantic Ocean. But just because the vehicle had disintegrated did not mean the crew compartment had stopped moving at high speed. Carried forward by its own momentum, it climbed in a ballistic arc to a maximum altitude of 65,000 feet, or just under 20,000 meters. Then it began its long fall from the edge of the stratosphere all the way down to the surface. It plunged toward the ocean, rapidly accelerating to terminal velocity as it dropped earthward like a bullet fired at water. Most people have probably heard that at terminal velocity, striking water is roughly the same as hitting solid concrete. It was this impact with the sea that ultimately determined the fate of the Challenger crew. The module took 2 minutes and 45 seconds to fall back to Earth after reaching its highest point. That is an almost unimaginable length of time to be falling toward the planet. Many people also assume that the descent would have finally and mercifully rendered the crew unconscious as they tumbled toward Earth in a spinning compartment that could not be controlled. It had no wings, no engine, no nose cone, no fuselage, no cargo bay, and nothing that could influence or guide their fall. But perhaps that assumption was also wrong. Investigators later discovered that during the descent, the oxygen packs for Smith and Scobie had been manually activated by Judith Resnick, one of the mission specialists mentioned earlier, from her seat directly behind the pilot and commander. Even if the module was spinning violently and generating heavy G-forces, both Scobie and Smith were seasoned test pilots who had extensive experience with such conditions. Regardless, the act of activating the emergency air supply proved that at least some level of conscious decision-making was taking place among the crew during the fall. NASA determined that the forces from the breakup itself were not strong enough to shatter the cabin windows, and investigators could not identify a definitive breach in the pressure shell or a clear point where air would have certainly escaped. Now, that does not necessarily mean the structure stayed airtight enough to prevent depressurization entirely, but it does mean NASA could not find conclusive evidence either way. Ultimately, the crew module they recovered from the ocean was so severely crushed and twisted into a mangled piece of wreckage that reaching a definitive conclusion on this question proved impossible. If the cabin did stay pressurized, as suggested by the activation of multiple emergency air packs and the operation of switches after the breakup, there is every possibility that at least some of the crew remained conscious all the way down until they hit the ocean surface. Alternative theories propose that the cabin may have gradually lost pressure or air over time following the breakup, since not every emergency air pack was activated. In the end, both NASA and Dr. Joseph Kerwin, an astronaut and physician who led the investigation into the crew's deaths, concluded that the forces experienced during Challenger's breakup in the air were probably not enough to cause death or severe injury on their own, so they likely all survived the initial explosion. But when you consider the implications of these findings, the true horror becomes clear. Those watching on television were not witnessing the sudden and instantaneous deaths of 7 astronauts. They were watching the final moments of those 7 people and the sheer conscious terror they must have experienced as they plummeted toward Earth at terminal velocity for nearly 3 minutes. It is impossible not to wonder what those inside the module were thinking during those moments, knowing they would soon strike the Earth at 207 miles per hour with nothing to protect them or slow their descent. They surely must have understood it was not a situation anyone could survive. Above all, one cannot help but think about what was going through Christa McAuliffe's mind. Christa McAuliffe was a teacher who had won a competition, not a veteran astronaut or test pilot. Had it not been for what was essentially a political publicity stunt, she never would have been aboard that shuttle. When NASA issued their official findings, they stated that the exact cause of death for the astronauts could not be determined with absolute certainty. A spokesperson from the agency went on record saying they would probably never know for sure. But that statement conceals itself behind deliberate vagueness. When you weigh all the available evidence, the most probable scenario is that the majority of the crew perished when the crew compartment struck the ocean surface, not in the moments leading up to that impact. There is also a reasonable possibility that at least some of them remained conscious all the way until those final seconds. That said, certain people are entirely persuaded that every member of the crew survived until the module hit the water. One such individual was Robert Overmyer, a 3-time space shuttle commander who himself died in a plane crash in 1996 while testing an experimental Cirrus VK-30 aircraft. For Overmyer, there was absolutely no doubt the crew remained alive throughout the fall, and he had been close friends with Commander Francis Scobie. In an interview, he said he had not only flown missions with Dick Scobie, but they had even owned an airplane together, and he was certain that Scobie did everything humanly possible to save his crew. He believed Scobie fought for every possible advantage to ensure their survival, and flew that crippled spacecraft without wings the entire way down. The aftermath of the entire tragedy was unspeakably grim. On the evening of January 28, 1986, President Ronald Reagan honored the Challenger crew in a somber televised address to the nation, delivering what remains one of the most memorable statements ever made about space exploration. The late president said they would never forget the crew members, nor would they forget seeing them that morning as they prepared for their mission, waved goodbye, and slipped the surly bonds of Earth to touch the face of God. That is a powerful quote. Reagan would shortly thereafter establish a presidential commission led by former Secretary of State William P. Rogers to investigate exactly what caused Challenger to be destroyed. The very next morning, on January 29th, the recovery vessel USS Preserver was dispatched to search for what remained of the shuttle. This included not just the crew module itself, but any fragments or wreckage. Divers were given the somber and heroic task of locating the crew cabin along with the remains of the 7 people who had been inside. The very least the United States could do was ensure they received a dignified funeral. 6 weeks later, in early March, searchers located the crew compartment using sonar technology roughly 15 miles or 24 kilometers off the Florida coastline. Investigators ultimately recovered approximately 3/4 of the module. However, it was a mangled wreck of twisted debris rather than anything resembling an intact crew compartment. Analysis later determined that it struck the water with a force of roughly 200 times the force of gravity, which also destroyed most of the physical evidence of what had occurred during the descent while the module was plummeting. All 7 astronauts were still strapped into their seats, with their harnesses secured and their spacesuits still worn. Fortunately, NASA established a security perimeter to keep private vessels and media crews at a safe distance. Divers then worked to attach lifting apparatus to bring what remained of the crew module up from the dark ocean floor. The entire operation was conducted under significant secrecy. Material that was recovered was transported to Patrick Air Force Base, where specialists from the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology conducted identification procedures and examination of both bodies and equipment. By mid-April of 1986, they had recovered everything they could from the crew compartment, and all 7 astronauts had been positively identified through their remains. Whatever could be identified was returned to the families for burial. What could not be identified was laid to rest beneath the Challenger Memorial at Arlington National Cemetery in Washington, District of Columbia. For years following the disaster, small fragments and pieces of Challenger continued to wash ashore on beaches in and around Cape Canaveral. People would search the beaches and turn over whatever they discovered to NASA so it could be examined in the years that followed. Only 47% of the entire spacecraft was ever recovered, and pieces continue to appear occasionally. The last major fragments to wash ashore were uncovered at Cocoa Beach in 1996, when substantial sections of the left wing were discovered. More recently, documentary divers located a large, tile-covered section partially buried beneath the seabed off the Florida coast in 2022. The rest remains out there somewhere in the ocean. Investigator specialists and experienced astronauts like Robert Overmyer, whom we mentioned earlier, combed through every single fragment of debris and analyzed every scrap of tracking data to reconstruct what happened to Challenger and uncover the information that we have been sharing with you throughout this episode. They determined that at the precise moment the main fuel tank ignited, when a wave of flames surged upward past the window of pilot Mike Smith, there could be no doubt that Smith realized they were in serious danger. He understood they were confronting something that had never occurred before in the entire history of American spaceflight. Once the investigations were completed, the debris examined, and the dust had fully settled, the reports outlined the necessary corrective measures to address the mechanical, operational, and organizational factors that had contributed to the Challenger explosion. It goes without saying there would be no more launches in freezing temperatures or dismissal of engineer warnings. The tragic aspect of all of this is that it was entirely preventable. There were multiple moments when the disaster could have been averted. But if nothing else, Challenger provided us with the lessons needed to make space travel safer for astronauts around the globe. Sadly, it appears some lessons were not fully absorbed, as the Columbia Space Shuttle disaster occurred in 2003, which only magnified the tragedy of the original Challenger disaster when another 7 astronauts lost their lives. After a 32-month pause in all space-related launch operations, astronauts returned to flight in 1988 with the orbiter Discovery, demonstrating that even the most devastating circumstances and events cannot stop the relentless march of human technological advancement. McAuliffe had never aimed to become the first civilian to reach space, but those who knew her described her as a fearless individual determined to prove that teachers were every bit as capable as anyone else. And while she did accomplish that, she also became arguably the most recognizable name associated with America's worst space shuttle disaster. She was laid to rest in Concord in an unmarked grave. Her husband was concerned that tourists would flock to the location otherwise, and he wanted her to finally rest undisturbed. Barbara Morgan had been chosen as the backup candidate for NASA's Teacher in Space program back in the 1980s. After the Challenger tragedy, she continued working with NASA's Education Division. She eventually became a mission specialist in 1998 and was the first educator to. In 2007, aboard the Space Shuttle Endeavour, Barbara Morgan became the first teacher to officially make it to space, finally completing the journey that McAuliffe had been chosen for all those years earlier, but never had the chance to finish. By June of 1986, the wreckage of Challenger had been placed in an abandoned missile silo at Cape Canaveral. Critics argued that the space agency was essentially burying the evidence once the inquiries had wrapped up. Years later, portions of the debris were moved to the Kennedy Space Center, where they remain on public display. The shadow of Challenger stretched far beyond its tragic loss, partly because of its enduring impact and partly because of unfounded theories that emerged later. In 2015, a fabricated claim surfaced suggesting that the crew had somehow survived and were living ordinary lives across the United States, based on supposed lookalikes with similar names found years after the disaster. The motive behind such a fabrication remains unclear, and the entire notion has been thoroughly disproven, particularly since many of the alleged doubles turned out to be brothers and sisters of the astronauts who perished that day. Still, conspiracy theorists continue to cling to it. What Challenger ultimately represented was a pivotal chapter in American history, one that demanded introspection and accountability. It was a moment not just to pledge improvement, but to follow through with genuine action. The response to this tragedy showed the proper way to honor such loss, with compassion, with resolve, and with an unwavering commitment to pushing beyond the limits of what we know. Perhaps President Reagan captured it most powerfully when he spoke to the country in the aftermath. "The future," he said, "does not belong to those who hesitate. It belongs to those who dare."